Hello and welcome to the Passenger Seat Podcast, a podcast designed to fill your passenger seat with chat about classic cars, all recorded from my 1968 Morris Minor Peggy. I'm Becca, and today I'm driving home from work via my parents' house to go and water their plants. There's quite a few roadworks and diversions on the way to my parents' house today. Unfortunately, there seems to be a few bits and pieces being done. So it means that the diversions are actually taking me past where Peggy used to live. So it's been nice to kind of spot those out before I turned the camera on. But now we're kind of on the way and heading in their direction. Classic car ownership today is that as classic car drivers we tend to be a little bit more fussy compared to some people about the kind of cars we drive, and we tend to form pretty strong opinions about some of the cars that we drive, and so that leads quite nicely into today's topic, which is my car history. So in today's podcast I am going to be talking about all the cars that I've driven, which will lead nicely into a future podcast where I will talk about all the cars that I would really love to drive. So I'm going to go through kind of all the cars that I've driven, give you a bit of background about them, some of the places and trips that I took them on, and my opinions on them. These aren't necessarily my opinions on all of the cars of that make and model that exist out there, but just kind of my opinions of the particular ones that I ended up driving at the time. So the very first car that I drove and took out on both the roads and initially that very nervous drive around a little car park was a red Daewoo Matiz. It was a car that my family had owned at the time for a couple of years and had taken out to as a kind of second family car. It was I think a late 90s one, and it was one that my mum very proudly tells us was one of the very few cars that she'd bought by herself. She'd bought it while my dad was away in the Falklands and made the decision that it was going to be a Ladybird. So she purchased the red car and a few little Ladybirds for the inside of it, and then asked my dad to see if he could get some vinyl printed of some black dots and a big black strip to go down the middle to turn it into a little Ladybird. And it was quite a funny little car to drive around in because of that. It certainly gained quite a lot of attention from kind of people you were passing by, particularly children. So it really taught you quite a lot about kind of hazard perception, because a lot of the kids perhaps didn't quite realise that it was as dangerous as every other car because it looked so friendly. I did enjoy kind of some of the attention and being able to spot the car in the car park when I was learning to drive in it, and also when I drove it for about a year after I passed my test. But other than that, it was something that I was pretty pleased when my parents came to sell. It wasn't a particularly comfortable car to sit in. We did myself and Jamie do a really long trip in it. I think fun stops on the way is definitely the way to go. And so it was hot, it was really quite uncomfortable, the seats were not the most comfortable, and I also developed a bit of a concern at the time for the clutch. I thought the clutch was going because it really wasn't gear changing as well as it had been, so partway through that trip I took up the mantra of double declutching, something I was thankfully somewhat aware of due to having classic cars in the family. So took up double declutching to make those clutch changes a little bit better. Turned out that the mat had just kind of slid underneath the clutch pedal and was making it quite difficult. But even when we pulled it out, it wasn't the best clutch. So whilst I had some kind of very enjoyable adventures in the car, it was more about kind of the places that we were going rather than the car. The car was just a very interesting looking means of getting there. So after we'd done the kind of trip to Bakewell and realised that perhaps something was going wrong with the clutch eventually, we decided to put the car up for sale. My sister was starting to think about learning to drive, and so having a car that was definitely going to be reliable and have a good clutch for her to learn on was quite important. So we put the car up for sale, and we had quite an interesting experience with the sale. I think it only went up for about £500 on Gumtree, and we were looking for kind of a local buyer maybe that was interested in it for parts or something. But in the end we had a young girl message us all the way from South Wales, and she was interested in coming over, seeing the car with her boyfriend and her dad. So they travelled over after they'd finished work that day and actually got to us at about 1 a.m. in the morning, and took the car for kind of a little drive, 10 minutes around the block at midnight, well 1 a.m. in the morning, decided that they were more than happy with the car and drove it back that night. They sorted insurance, tax, everything out on our driveway at 1 a.m. in the morning. It was very strange, very unusual, but she was really keen to have the car because it turned out that her boyfriend and her dad both worked in automotive, and her boyfriend was really keen in making sleeper cars, so she wanted a really cute looking sleeper car for herself to take kind of rallying in and around the South Wales valleys. So the engine was going to be ripped out and everything. A big souped up engine was going to be put in, and she was going to start racing and rallying it. I've never actually looked into what happened to the car, kind of putting the registration plate into the government website, but I suspect I will probably kind of try and track down what the number plate was off my parents and find that one out, because it was quite an interesting story, and I hope that is what happened to it. Whilst I did a lot of kind of practice driving and early kind of clutch control with my dad in that Matiz, my driving instructor actually had quite a series of Ford Fiestas. I remember that in the weeks kind of leading up to my test, I think he went through a different Ford Fiesta every week for about 4 weeks, because there kept being issues with his one, so he kept taking it back to the dealership. They kept giving him a courtesy car, and then he'd take it back and he'd get a different courtesy car. And a lot of people expressed quite a lot of sympathy for that situation, purely because it's a little bit stressful to have to learn another car quite soon to your test. But I think it probably prepared me for not being too worried about always driving the same car and getting quite comfortable with other cars. I didn't mind driving the Ford Fiestas. They weren't bad cars. They did feel very modern activities that I was kind of practicing in, a lot of kind of mod cons and things like that, but certainly not a bad car. I'm sure that they work fine. I had no issues with the kind of comfortability and stuff of it, but obviously my driving instructor was having some serious problems with the kind of mechanicals and the dealership at the time. So I guess that depends on what you're looking for in a car. When my family sold the Daewoo Matiz, they hired up a car from a kind of local garage that is a Nissan Micra. It's a 55 plate Nissan Micra, and I really loved driving that car. I had a lot of fun. It felt really fun to drive. You were quite low, it was quite nippy, and it was really generally a very enjoyable car to drive. I had no problems with it, and I love it so much that whenever I have to leave Peggy at my parents' house because there's ongoing works or things like that, I would much rather pick up the keys and take the Micra back to mine as kind of a courtesy car than to take my partner's car out for a drive and things like that. And I'll get to that car in a little bit. But it's so much fun, very happy little car. Could get some speed on it really, and I really enjoyed driving it. I don't mind picking up the keys to it occasionally now, and as far as kind of modern cars go, it's certainly my favourite that I've driven so far, although my kind of experience is probably quite limited. both of the cars to an event, and I'll be able to drive her as well and get some more experience of driving her. The next kind of chronological car within my car history is, of course, Peggy. I bought Peggy because I couldn't really take my family's Nissan Micra with me. My sister needed it to learn to drive when I moved out, and I talk a lot about that in my first podcast. In terms of the driving experience, I find her incredibly comfortable. I've got the original seats in, and I don't feel the need to really change them. I find the driving position very comfortable. I wasn't struggling with comfort and things like that over that really long drive that we did a few weeks ago, nor on the time that we drove to Wales. So really enjoy the kind of experience and comfort of driving her. I don't struggle with the kind of gear shifts. I don't find the steering heavy. The Morris Minors tend to be quite good for that, from what I've heard. And generally it's just a very enjoyable experience. I find her incredibly comfortable to do long distances in. I love taking her for a little kind of potter to the shop, and as much as I loved my experience of driving Nelly, Peggy is definitely my favourite drive that I've had so far, and I'm sure that you're not surprised by that at all, given this podcast. In kind of the couple of months after me and my partner moved into our new house, his granddad gave him a Fiat Panda, a 57 plate Fiat Panda, for him to learn to drive in. He's passed his theory test, he's had a couple of lessons and things with various driving instructors, but because of one thing and another, primarily COVID, he's not quite passed his test just yet. So he did really need a kind of modern car that he could get a little bit of practice in and have as his own once he had finished his test, and he can use it as kind of a little runabout. Now, if you've ever spoken to me in person, you've probably heard me moan about this car. I find the Panda hugely uncomfortable. I would refuse to drive it for any further than like 30 minutes. It is faster, it is and that's really the only thing it's got going for it when I'm looking at the bowl of keys in the morning. So if I have to get somewhere really quick, then maybe I'll take the keys for the Fiat Panda. Or if Peggy's been misbehaving and isn't kind of on the road, then last week I had a week of driving the Fiat Panda to and from work, and it just was not the same at all. I hate driving it, and we've had a few issues with it as well, kind of battery related and wishbone suspension related. And so as lovely as it is that we've got that second car for kind of a second option and a backup, if I've dropped Peggy off for some work and I've been lent the Micra by my parents to get myself back home, I'm going to take the Micra out instead and put some petrol back in it for my parents, because it's just so uncomfortable. I think part of it is that the pedals are really high, and I've got quite small feet, so it's quite an uncomfortable reach up for me. I can't, no matter what I do, seem to find a comfortable seating position that doesn't hurt my feet and my ankles and things whilst I'm driving. So whilst it's faster, it's just such an unenjoyable drive for me personally. It's not a car that I think very highly of. And finally, I've had a very recent addition to my driving experiences at Thoresby Hall. last week's podcast, I had the opportunity to drive Liam's lone Austin 7. It was quite an interesting experience to kind of compare it to both Peggy and to the Singer. It was surprisingly more comfortable than I was expecting. It wasn't as comfortable as Nelly, but it wasn't as uncomfortable as I think a lot of people would think a 30s car was. It was a lot of fun. It was kind of lighter on the steering and things than I think a lot of people expect. The double declutching wasn't too difficult. I think it takes a little bit of getting used to, but perhaps the most difficult thing to do was probably just turning the car on with the starter and things like that. But really quite a fun little car that if you get the opportunity to have a go in an Austin 7, I think it's quite an unusual and unique driving experience, but there's quite a lot of them out there, so it's worth seeing if you can have that opportunity. So there you go, that is all the cars that I have had the opportunity to drive in, be that for 15 minutes round a car park or a field, or on 4-hour journeys. Obviously the shorter reviews may well be slightly kind of marred by the fact I've not had to drive them for a longer distance, but it is quite clear quite early on, I think, when you're driving a car, whether it's going to be a comfortable and enjoyable experience. I'd love to hear either via Instagram or in the YouTube comments, if that's where you're watching, what's the favourite car that you have driven, and what's your least favourite car that you've ever driven and why. Thank you so much for listening. Drive safely and happy motoring.